All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to talk about World War II and African Americans. So our objectives and standards to understand the conflict of World War II and to analyze the impact of African Americans during World War II. And take a moment there to look over standards, please. And our desired result. How did African Americans become involved in World War II? Excuse me. So joining the fight. When the United States joined the war in 1941, African Americans also support the war effort in different ways. Now remember, the war had been going on in Europe and in Asia for quite some time, and the United States joins after we are attacked at Pearl Harbor in 1941. But many African Americans served in the armed forces, excuse me, but they still faced segregation as well. Now there were 22 African American combat units that fought in Europe, and African Americans also received recognition in the armed forces for their contributions. The 969 Field Artillery Unit received recognition for their fighting. Benjamin O. Davis, the top picture there, he was the first African American general in the Army in 1940. And African Americans also served in the Army Air Corps, which was known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Sorry about that. This division formed after 1941 when African Americans protested segregation since they were not allowed to serve in the war. Now you can see the bottom picture. There is a picture of some of the Tuskegee Airmen. Now some of the things they did was they escorted, bombing missions and attacked installations. They flew 16,000 missions and destroyed enemy aircraft. More than 900 medals and honors were won, and in 2006, Congress voted them the Congressional Gold Medal. So a very important unit that played a very important role during the war effort and during the fighting in World War II. Now the war in African American women. Excuse me. During World War II, African American women also made contributions. Now in July of 1943, Congress created the Women's Army Corps, which was used for women to become more actively involved in the military in different units and in different roles. Now, African American women were only allowed to serve in hospital duties for African American soldiers in the beginning of the war. However, eventually roles spread to include work as lab technicians and librarians as well. In 1944, African American nurses were finally allowed to treat white soldiers as well. Now, Phyllis May Daly, she became the first African American woman in the Navy Nurse Corps, on March 8, 1945. And some 800 African American women formed the 688th Central Post Battalion in Europe in 1945. Now, their main goal, they were in charge of establishing a central postal directory in Europe, and the unit received praise for its performance, which included the arranging for delivery of 3 million pieces of backlogged mail. So obviously letters from home or from wherever was very important for soldiers as well. This picture here shows you some African American nurses in training, I believe in England, during the war as well. Now, support on the home front. While many African Americans fought or supported the troops abroad, many helped in important roles at home. Now, due to the war, many men, and women for that matter, volunteered to go, serve overseas, and this leaves factories and industries facing a shortage of workers. African Americans were welcomed to fill these spots to support the war effort, and they also took part in major labor unions that they had not before. Now, many industries and factories also switched over from making like brooms or sewing machines to making things like guns and tanks and boats and other necessary items during wartime. So this was important for the war effort as well. African Americans also joined their white neighbors in supporting the war financially and morally. For example, many people used supplies that were collected and conserved to be recycled for the troops, such as oil from cooking or gasoline, or they would do scrap metal drives to these, to collect these things, which would then be used for tanks or bullets or whatever the case may be. Excuse me. People also bought war bonds, which was giving money to the government to support the war effort. And people also planted victory gardens. Victory gardens were, growing tomatoes or lettuce. That way you weren't buying these things from farmers or grocers, and those items could be sent overseas to the soldiers and others to help win the war. So people grew their own food to help support the war effort as well. Now, there is some trouble in discrimination, though. However, during World War II, many organizations did not want to accept African American volunteers, and we see racial tension and violence occurred as African Americans moved to northern cities. Remember, many African Americans are moving out of the South for better jobs, better lives, and this is going to create tension. And the limited availability of housing and jobs also increased racial tensions as well. In the summer of 1943, there were riots in Harlem, New York, Detroit, Michigan, Los Angeles, California, and Beaumont, Texas. On June 20th, 1943, perhaps the deadliest riots took place in Detroit, Michigan. Now, what started as minor conflicts were spread by rumors, and it started mob violence. The riot lasted for 3 days, and 25 African Americans and 3 whites were killed, among many others injured and destruction of property and things like that. The federal government finally had to intervene, and President Roosevelt declared a state of emergency, and eventually troops were sent to restore the peace for 6 months, and the situation dissolved, and planning was used to prevent future violent outbursts. All right, in our closure, how did African Americans become involved in World War II? Think about the soldiers fighting, and sailors and pilots and all that stuff. How did African American women become involved in the war effort? And then how did African Americans support the war at home as well? Hope you have a great week. Please let me know of any questions or concerns, and I hope to talk to you all soon. Talk to you later, everybody. Bye-bye.